A stormy night, a broken-down car, and a mechanic who had no idea that the woman he was helping was one of the most powerful CEOs in the country. Jake Mitchell had spent years keeping his head down, fixing engines, and avoiding the ghosts of his past. He never cared about wealth, power, or the kind of people who wore designer suits and made billion-dollar deals. But when a stranded woman with fire in her eyes and secrets in her heart stumbled into his garage one fateful night, everything changed. What started as a simple act of kindness soon became something more, a connection neither of them expected, a battle between two worlds that should have never collided. But when betrayal, heartbreak, and second chances come knocking, will love be enough to bridge the gap between them? If you love romance, small-town charm, and powerful emotional storytelling, then this is a journey you don't want to miss. Before we dive into this unforgettable love story, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a single moment of passion, heartbreak, and redemption. Hit that like button, turn on notifications, and let's begin. Because sometimes the best love stories start with a little bit of fate. Now let's begin. Poor mechanic fixed a stranger girl's car for free, unaware she's a billionaire CEO. Next. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked windshield as Isabella. Carter gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white. The meeting had drained her, leaving her restless and suffocated by the relentless demands of corporate life. Carter Enterprises, the empire she had built from the ground up, had become a gilded cage, trapping her in a world of acquisitions, numbers, and never-ending negotiations. Tonight, she needed an escape. The open road outside the city was a welcome relief from the towering glass buildings and flashing billboards. The rhythmic hum of the tires against the wet pavement provided a temporary solace. She hadn't planned where she was going, she just drove, seeking an unfamiliar place where no one knew her name, where she could breathe. Then the rain came. It started as a light drizzle, but within minutes it turned into a relentless downpour. The storm howled through the trees lining the highway, and the Mercedes-Benz S-Class beneath her hands suddenly jerked, the engine sputtering in protest. "No, no, not now," Isabella muttered, her heart pounding as she eased the car to the side of the deserted road. She tried restarting it. Nothing. The headlights flickered before dying completely, leaving her surrounded by darkness. She glanced at her phone. No signal. Frustration bubbled inside her. This wasn't supposed to happen. People like her, wealthy, powerful, weren't supposed to get stranded in the middle of nowhere. But tonight, none of that mattered. The rain hammered against the roof of the car as she exhaled sharply, trying to think. Then, in the distance, a pair of headlights appeared through the storm. She straightened, a flicker of hope rising within her. The vehicle slowed as it neared, an old Ford pickup truck, worn but sturdy. The driver's side door creaked open, and a man stepped out, his silhouette outlined against the rain. He approached, without hesitation, his heavy boots splashing against the muddy roadside. As he drew closer, Isabella could make out a strong, weathered face beneath the hood of his jacket. A man in his late 30s, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to assess her situation with quiet confidence. "Looks like you've got some trouble," he said, his voice calm, steady. She hesitated before nodding. "My car just died. I have no signal." The man didn't seem fazed. "Mind if I take a look?" She hesitated again. This was not her world. She wasn't used to trusting strangers. But something in his demeanor, his lack of urgency, the way he didn't even ask her who she was, made her nod. He moved without hesitation, popping the hood, his fingers moving deftly as he examined the engine. Rain streamed down his jacket, but he didn't seem to notice. He worked in comfortable silence, like a man who had done this 100 times before. She found herself studying him, The quiet confidence, the unhurried patience, the way his rough hands moved with a precision that spoke of years of experience. He was nothing like the men she knew in the boardroom, all sharp suits and ruthless ambition. After a few minutes, he wiped his wet hands on his jeans and looked up. "Battery's fine, starter's shot," he sighed, glancing at the rain. "I can fix it, but it'll take a little time." Isabella nodded, though she barely heard him. She was still trying to process the strangeness of this moment. A billionaire CEO, stranded in a rainstorm, relying on the kindness of a stranger. "You from around here?" she asked, trying to break the silence. He shook his head. "Lived here for a while, not originally." She waited for him to say more, but he didn't. "Do you—" She hesitated. "Do you do this often? Stop for strangers in the rain?" The corner of his lips curved slightly, the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him. "Depends on the stranger?" For some reason, that made her chest tighten. Minutes stretched into longer moments. The rain didn't let up, soaking them both, but neither of them moved. She wasn't sure why, but for the first time in years, she wasn't in a hurry. Finally, he closed the hood and wiped his hands on a rag from his pocket. "Try it now." She slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared back to life. Relief washed over her, but something else stirred within her, a strange reluctance to just leave. She rolled down the window, the rain still coming down in thick sheets. "How much do I owe you?" The man shook his head. "Nothing." She frowned. "You fixed my car in the middle of a storm. You should be paid for that." He simply shrugged. "Not everything's about money." She blinked. No one had ever said that to her before, not in her world. At her hesitation, he leaned slightly against the truck, his voice quieter but firm. "If you ever see someone in need, just do the same for them." Something about the way he said it lodged itself deep in her chest, an unfamiliar weight pressing against her ribs. Before she could find the words to respond, he stepped back, as if signaling that the encounter was over. She hesitated one more second before nodding, rolling up her window and putting the car into gear. The storm had not yet passed, but as she pulled away, she felt as if something inside her had shifted, like a fault line deep beneath the surface. Of her carefully controlled world had cracked, just a little. She checked the rearview mirror once. The man was already walking back to his truck, disappearing into the storm, as if he had never been there at all. She didn't even know his name, but she had a feeling she wouldn't forget him anytime soon. The rain had passed, but its imprint remained, not just on the road slick with water, but deep within Isabella Carter's mind. As her Mercedes glided back onto the highway, she found herself gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. The car wipers slashed rhythmically across the windshield, but her thoughts were tangled in a storm of their own. She stole a glance in the rearview mirror. The stranger and his old truck were gone, swallowed by the darkness. It was as if he had never been there, but he had been, and so had his words. "If you ever see someone in need, just do the same for them." She had spent years in boardrooms, surrounded by men and women who wielded power like a weapon, where everything, every handshake, every decision had a price. And yet here was a man, a mechanic in a worn-out jacket, who had given her something, without expecting anything in return. She exhaled sharply. Why was that so hard to grasp? She shook her head, trying to focus on the road. It was nothing, she told herself, just a passing encounter, a random act of kindness from a stranger. It wasn't supposed to matter. It wasn't supposed to follow her home, but it did. By the time Isabella reached the city skyline, the rain had turned into a fine mist. The neon glow of Manhattan reflected off the wet streets, painting everything in hues of gold and silver. She pulled into the underground parking garage of her luxury apartment building, stepping out of the car with her usual poise, except tonight. Something felt different. The moment she stepped into the elevator, the weight of her reality came rushing back. Her phone, which had been buzzing non-stop for the past hour, showed dozens of missed calls and emails from her executive team. The Carter Enterprises logo glared back at her from the screen, reminding her of the world she had built, the empire she had fought for. Her assistant, Eleanor, had left a voicemail. "Ms. Carter, I hope you're all right. The board is expecting you first thing in the morning. There are urgent matters regarding the auto company acquisition. Call me when you can." Isabella closed her eyes. The meeting, the acquisition, the next big corporate move. She sighed and scrolled through her inbox, her fingers moving automatically. Contracts, stock reports, a proposal from the legal team. Each email more impersonal than the last. She had built a fortress of numbers, negotiations, and power, but tonight, for the first time in years, it felt hollow. As the elevator doors slid open, she stepped into her penthouse, a marvel of glass, steel, and emptiness. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, a breathtaking testament to her success. But tonight, it felt more like a gilded cage. She tossed her phone onto the kitchen counter and headed straight for the wine cabinet. A deep red Cabernet Sauvignon from an exclusive Napa Valley vineyard. A wine fit for a billionaire. She poured herself a glass and walked to the window, staring out at the city that never slept, just like her mind tonight. She tried to distract herself. She went over financial reports, answered a few urgent emails, even skimmed through a proposal that needed her approval. But her mind kept drifting back to him, to the man with piercing blue eyes, the one who hadn't cared about who she was or what she owned, to his quiet confidence. The way he moved with certainty, his hands working with purpose, unbothered by wealth, power, or status. She didn't even know his name, but he had left something behind. A question she couldn't shake. What was success worth if she had no one to share it with? She had spent years building Carter Enterprises, transforming it into one of the most powerful conglomerates in the country. She had outmaneuvered ruthless competitors, dominated industries, and proven that she could stand among the titans of Wall Street. But at the end of the day, she came home to silence, to a penthouse that felt more like a glass museum than a home. Was that what she had really wanted? Or had she been so focused on winning that she had never stopped to ask why she was playing in the first place? She set the wine glass down with a quiet clink, suddenly restless. She walked through her penthouse, past modern art pieces worth more than most people made in a lifetime, past designer furniture that had been selected by an interior designer because she had never had time to pick it herself. Everything in her life was polished, perfect, curated. But it wasn't real. Not like the rain, not like the man who had helped her without expecting anything in return. Isabella tried to sleep. She really did, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw rain. She saw his silhouette against the storm, the way he had worked without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. And worst of all, she saw the way he had walked away without even looking back. She wasn't used to that. In her world, people clung to her, chased her, demanded things from her, but not him. Why? Why had he helped her and just left? She turned onto her side, staring at the dim glow of the city outside her window. Why did she care? It should have been nothing, just a forgettable moment in a long, exhausting day, and yet it wasn't. By morning, her decision was made. She would go back. She needed to see him again. She needed to understand why a simple act of kindness from a stranger had shaken her world more than any billion-dollar deal ever had. The city moved at a relentless pace, meetings scheduled down to the second, deals negotiated with cutthroat precision, and power measured in contracts and stock prices. For Isabella Carter, this had always been her world. But ever since that night in the rain, something had shifted, As she sat at the head of a gleaming glass conference table, surrounded by Carter Enterprises' top executives, she found herself only half listening. Numbers flashed on a massive screen. Profit projections, market trends, expected returns, but for the first time in her life, they felt hollow. She adjusted the gold pen in her fingers, forcing herself to focus as her chief financial officer, Victor Lancaster, continued his presentation. With the acquisition of D&L Automotive, Carter Enterprises will eliminate a struggling competitor while securing complete dominance in the regional auto manufacturing market. The factory itself is outdated, and its labor force is largely blue-collar, which means we can downsize immediately without regulatory pushback. Victor's voice was smooth, practiced. It was exactly the kind of logic that had made Carter Enterprises a dominant force on Wall Street. Isabella should have nodded. She should have approved the plan, just as she had done countless times before. Instead, a strange unease settled in her chest. Its labor force is largely blue-collar. Her grip on the pen tightened. Her mind flashed back to grease-stained hands working beneath a hood, a steady voice in the rain, a man who didn't ask for anything in return. Jake. A sinking feeling crept into her stomach. What factory was Victor talking about? She tapped her manicured nails against the table. Where exactly is D&L Automotive located? Victor barely glanced up from his spreadsheet. Small town operation, nothing significant. Some town called Fairfield. The air left her lungs. Fairfield, Jake's town. The realization hit her like a punch to the chest. The factory they were shutting down, the one described as nothing more than an outdated facility with disposable workers, was the economic lifeline of the town she had just driven through. And Jake was one of those disposable workers. Isabella never hesitated in business. That was why she was a CEO, why she had built an empire, why people feared and respected her. But right now, she hesitated. She could already hear the arguments in her head, the board's expectations, the shareholders' demands, the pressure to maintain Carter Enterprises' dominance. Victor was still speaking, oblivious to the war raging inside her mind. The best approach is an immediate buyout. We strip the factory for parts, relocate assets, liquidate the workforce. We estimate a $27 million profit increase by Q3. A $27 million increase. To Carter Enterprises, it was a fraction of their annual earnings, barely a blip on a balance sheet, but to Jake and the people of Fairfield, it was everything. She knew she needed to say something. She cleared her throat. What about the workers? The room fell silent. Victor finally looked up, blinking. I'm sorry. The workers, Isabella repeated, her voice carefully neutral. What happens to them when we shut the factory down? Victor exchanged a glance with Miriam Graves, the company's chief legal officer. They'll be laid off, Miriam said slowly, as if explaining something to a child. That's standard procedure in acquisitions like this. A few of the other executives chuckled, shaking their heads. Of course, Isabella thought bitterly. To them, this is normal. She pressed her lips together, her mind racing. If you ever see someone in need, just do the same for them. Jake's words echoed in her head, louder than the voices in the boardroom. She had spent her career making decisions based on profit and power. But this was different. This time, she couldn't ignore the faces behind the numbers. This time, she knew the people who would suffer, and she couldn't pretend it didn't matter. Isabella took a slow, measured breath. She needed to see it with her own eyes. Because if she was going to fight this battle, if she was going to stand against her own board and risk everything, she needed to be sure. She set her pen down and leaned back in her chair. I want a full report on D&L Automotive's impact on Fairfield, employment numbers, community dependence, economic projections if we shut it down. Victor frowned. Is that really necessary? Isabella fixed him with a look that made Wall Street executives shrink in their seats. Did I ask for a debate? Victor immediately fell silent. She pushed back from the table. Meeting adjourned. Without waiting for a response, she strode out of the boardroom, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She was going back to Fairfield. She needed to see Jake again. She needed to see the town they were about to destroy, because for the first time in her life, she wasn't just looking at numbers on a spreadsheet. She was looking at real people, and she wasn't sure she could walk away from that. The skyline of Manhattan faded in her rearview mirror, replaced by the endless stretch of open road. For the first time in years, Isabella Carter was driving without a specific destination dictated by business. But she knew exactly where she was going. She hadn't sent an assistant to research Fairfield. She hadn't ordered a report filled with numbers and projections. She needed to see it herself. The further she got from the city, the more she felt something unfamiliar. A strange sense of quiet anticipation. It was ridiculous, really. What did she expect to find? That one night in the rain had shaken her more than it should have. It was just a moment, a fleeting encounter with a stranger, and yet she was returning. Not as Isabella Carter, CEO of Carter Enterprises, but as a woman searching for something she couldn't name. Fairfield looked different in the daylight. The rain that had drenched the streets a few nights ago was gone, replaced by crisp autumn air. Small brick buildings lined the main road, each with a hand-painted sign hanging over its door. A family-run diner, a hardware store, a bakery that smelled like cinnamon and fresh bread. There were no high-rises, no billboards, no endless streams of taxis honking impatiently. Instead, people walked slowly, stopped to chat with their neighbors, carried bags of groceries from the corner store without rushing. She pulled into a parking space near the only auto shop in town, a modest building with a faded blue sign that read Mitchell's Garage. Her stomach tightened. This was Jake's place. She wasn't sure why she hesitated. Maybe because, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't in control of the situation. Taking a breath, she stepped out of the car. The garage was open air, the scent of oil and metal lingering in the crisp autumn air. Jake Mitchell was standing under the hood of an old truck, sleeves rolled up, his hands working with quiet precision. He didn't look up at first, completely focused on the engine in front of him. Isabella took a step forward. "Need a hand?" Jake stilled. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, slowly, he turned. When his blue eyes met hers, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. "You again." It wasn't a question, more like a quiet statement of disbelief. She crossed her arms, suddenly unsure what to say. She had rehearsed different explanations on the drive here, but none of them sounded right. "I was passing through," she said finally. "Thought I'd stop by." Jake wiped his hands on a rag, his expression unreadable. "Not exactly a place people pass through." She almost smiled. He saw through her immediately. A few moments of silence passed between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that existed between two people who weren't in a rush to fill the space with empty words. Then, to her surprise, Jake motioned to the truck. "Since you're here," he said, "hold this for me." She blinked. "You want me to help?" "You offered, didn't you?" She hesitated. She wasn't exactly dressed for manual labor, but after a moment she stepped forward. Jake handed her a wrench. For the first time in her life, Isabella Carter was standing in a garage, holding a tool that she wasn't entirely sure how to use. And strangely, she didn't hate it. As she worked alongside Jake, or at least attempted to, she began to notice the rhythm of the garage. The people who came and went weren't just customers. A woman in her 60s arrived with a plate of cookies, shaking her head at Jake. "You didn't charge my nephew for fixing his car last week." Jake shrugged. He needed the car for work. Wasn't a big deal. A man in his 70s sat on a bench outside, sipping coffee. "Jake, you still coming by to fix Mrs. Porter's heater this weekend?" Jake nodded. "Saturday morning." Another customer, a single mother, came in with a broken taillight. She looked worried, explaining that she couldn't afford the repair until next month. Jake didn't hesitate. "I'll fix it now. Pay me when you can." She blinked, clearly stunned. "Are you sure?" Jake just nodded once, already reaching for the tools. Isabella watched everything unfold, and for the first time she truly saw what Jake was. Not just a mechanic, not just the man who had helped her in the rain. He was the quiet backbone of this town, always fixing things, not just cars, but people's lives. And he never asked for anything in return. As the afternoon stretched on, Isabella found herself not wanting to leave. She hadn't checked her phone once. She had forgotten about Carter Enterprises, the boardroom, the endless pressure to be ruthless, efficient, unstoppable. Instead, she had spent the day watching kindness in its simplest form. And the strangest part, she liked it. By the time the sun began to set, Jake finally wiped his hands on a rag and looked at her. "You sticking around for dinner?" Isabella wasn't sure how to answer that. Because, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't rushing to leave. She wasn't thinking about what came next. She just wanted to be here, and that terrified her. The golden hues of the setting sun stretched over the small town of Fairfield, casting long shadows across Mitchell's garage. The scent of warm asphalt lingered in the air, mixing with the faint aroma of gasoline and motor oil. It was the kind of evening Isabella Carter never experienced in Manhattan, where the night sky was always drowned out by neon lights and skyscrapers. She sat on the hood of a half-repaired truck, watching Jake Mitchell finish up for the day. His movements were unhurried, methodical, so different from the high-stakes, breakneck speed of her world. He had barely spoken since she arrived earlier, but he didn't seem to mind her presence. She didn't mind either, for someone who had spent her entire life making deals, negotiating power, and outmaneuvering ruthless businessmen. The silence was strangely peaceful. Jake wiped his hands on a rag, tossing it onto a nearby workbench. Then, without looking at her, he spoke. "You don't belong here." Isabella blinked, caught off guard by the sudden statement. She could have denied it. She could have said she was here out of curiosity, or that she was just passing through. But both would have been lies. Instead, she asked, "Why do you think that?" Jake leaned against the garage door, arms crossed over his chest. "Because people like you don't just show up in towns like this unless they're looking for something." His voice was even, unreadable. Isabella held his gaze. "Maybe I am." His brow furrowed just slightly before he looked away. For a moment, she thought he might ignore her response entirely, but then, with a sigh, he ran a hand through his damp hair and murmured, "You're wasting your time." She should have let it go. She should have walked away, accepted that Jake was just another stranger she had met by chance, but something inside her told her to stay. The silence stretched between them. Isabella knew she was pushing into something personal, but she wasn't the kind of woman who backed down easily. "You weren't always here, were you?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Jake let out a quiet chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "That obvious," she nodded. "You're too good at what you do, too precise. I've seen a lot of people who are good at their jobs, and it's not just experience, it's training. Formal training." Jake exhaled slowly. He glanced toward the open garage doors, his eyes following the distant horizon. "I used to be an engineer," he admitted. Isabella sat up a little straighter. "An engineer?" Jake nodded. "Automotive design. Worked for a big-name company back in Detroit. Designed engines, safety systems, spent years buried in blueprints and calculations." She hadn't expected that. A man like Jake, who lived, simply worked with his hands and refused payment for helping strangers, had once been at the forefront of vehicle innovation. "What happened?" she asked softly. For the first time, he hesitated. A shadow crossed his features, and he turned slightly, his fingers gripping the edge of the workbench. Then, in a voice quieter than before, he answered, "My wife and daughter were killed in a crash." The words hit her like a punch to the chest. She hadn't expected that. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. There were no rehearsed business responses, no corporate platitudes that could soften a loss like that. He didn't seem to be waiting for a response. He just continued, as if speaking the words aloud was punishment enough. "There was a flaw in the vehicle's safety system," he said. "A minor defect, something most people would have overlooked. But I worked on that model. I designed the system that was supposed to protect them." His jaw clenched. "And it failed." Isabella's chest tightened. She had heard a million business stories, companies cutting corners, executives making cold decisions that affected thousands. But this was different. This was personal. "I fought the company," Jake continued, his voice bitter, tried to get them to admit their mistake. But money talks, lawyers buried it. They settled quietly, never acknowledged what really happened. He let out a sharp breath, his shoulders tense with the weight of it all. "And after that, I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't sit in an office designing machines when I knew how much could go wrong." Isabella felt the pain in his words, the rawness of a man who had carried guilt for too long. So that's why he was here. That's why he had walked away from a world of innovation and prestige, because he could never forgive himself. She watched him in the dim light of the garage. The quiet strength in his posture, the storm behind his eyes. He had lost everything, and instead of becoming bitter, instead of chasing vengeance, he had chosen kindness. He had built a life where he could still fix things, where he could still help people, even if it would never bring back the people he lost. And somehow, that was infinitely more powerful than all the men she had met in boardrooms who thought power was measured in numbers. For the first time since she had met him, she truly saw him. Not just as a mechanic, not just as the man who had helped her in the rain, but as someone who had taken his pain and turned it into something selfless. She swallowed. "You think you failed them." Jake didn't move. "You didn't," she said softly. For a moment she thought he might argue, that he might shake his head and push her words away like an unwanted gift. But he didn't. He just stood there, staring at the horizon, his hands curled into fists at his sides. And Isabella knew without a doubt that he had never allowed himself to believe that before. The air between them shifted, not in a way that either of them could fully understand, not yet, but in a way that changed something. Jake finally turned back to her, his gaze searching hers. "You're still here," he said, almost like a question. Isabella nodded. "Yeah," she murmured. "I am." And for the first time in a long time, she had no intention of leaving just yet. The days in Fairfield passed quicker than Isabella expected. She hadn't planned to stay. That had never been the intention. Yet here she was, helping out at a garage, drinking coffee at a small-town diner, waking up to crisp autumn air instead of the never-ending hum of the city, and somehow it didn't feel wrong. A new routine. It started subtly. At first, she only stopped by Mitchell's garage because she had nowhere else to be. But soon, it became part of her routine. Jake never asked why she kept coming back. He never questioned her presence, never pressed her for explanations. He simply handed her tools when she reached for them, taught her things without patronizing her, and let her exist in his world without demanding more. She wasn't used to that. In the corporate world, everything came with expectations, unspoken. Debts, power plays beneath the surface. But here, in the quiet hum of Jake's garage, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Ease. She was still Isabella Carter, still the woman who had built an empire. But here she wasn't defined by her last name. Here she was just Isabella, and maybe for the first time that was enough. Their conversations grew longer. They talked about everything except the obvious, the growing pull between them. Jake told her about Fairfield's people, about how he had found a home in this town even when he never intended to. Isabella told him about the city, about the pressure of always being 5 steps ahead. They were so different, yet somehow those differences fit. Sometimes she caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, and sometimes she let herself linger a little too long after the workday ended, standing outside the garage while the sun dipped below the horizon. Neither of them acknowledged it, because if they did, it would become real. One evening, Jake leaned against the workbench, arms crossed, studying her with quiet intensity. "You ever gonna tell me why you're really here?" Isabella hesitated, her fingers tightening around the wrench in her hands. She could have told him about the acquisition, about how Carter Enterprises was planning to wipe out the town's biggest employer. She could have told him that she was supposed to be making ruthless decisions, not fixing cars in a garage that smelled like motor oil and nostalgia. But instead, she shrugged. "I needed to get away." Jake held her gaze for a long moment before nodding. "Yeah," he said, voice quieter. "I know the feeling." And somehow that was enough, but Fairfield wasn't her world, and reality had a way of catching up. One afternoon, as she wiped grease from her fingers and tucked a stray piece of hair behind her ear, she heard the sound of heels clicking against pavement. She turned, heart sinking the moment she saw Eleanor standing at the edge of the garage, looking completely out of place in her tailored blazer and pencil skirt. Eleanor didn't belong here, and Isabella knew that meant one thing. Her world had come to drag her back. Eleanor crossed her arms. "Do you have any idea what's happening in the office right now?" Isabella exhaled. "I assume you're about to tell me." Eleanor's gaze flicked to Jake, who was watching silently from the other side of the garage, his expression unreadable. Then she turned back to Isabella. "The board is furious," she said. "They've called an emergency meeting. Investors are asking questions. Your absence is being noticed, and it's not good." A slow pressure built in Isabella's chest. She had known this moment was coming. She just hadn't expected it to sting this much. Jake wasn't saying anything, but Isabella could feel the shift in the air. She turned to him, trying to read what he wasn't saying out loud, and then, before she could speak, he said it for her. "This isn't your life," he murmured. She swallowed hard. "Jake," his jaw tightened. "You belong in your world, Isabella. This," he motioned toward the garage, toward the town. "This isn't where you stay." There was no anger in his voice, just acceptance, like he had known all along that she would leave eventually. Isabella had never been the kind of woman who second-guessed herself, but now she wasn't sure of anything. She took a slow step forward. "Jake, But he just shook his head. The conversation was over before it even began, and for the first time in years, Isabella Carter, a woman who had built an empire with her ability to negotiate anything, had no idea what to say. She left Fairfield that evening, not because she wanted to, but because Jake was right, and she hated that. As she drove back toward the city, headlights cutting through the growing darkness, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Loss. Not for a deal, not for power, but for something real, something she hadn't even realized she wanted until it was slipping through her fingers, and for the first time, she wondered, had she made the wrong choice? The road stretched before her, a long ribbon of asphalt cutting through the countryside, but Isabella Carter barely saw it. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, her knuckles white against the leather. She had left Fairfield. Left Jake. And for the first time in her carefully controlled life, she wasn't sure if she had made the right decision. He hadn't asked her to stay. That was what hurt the most. Isabella had spent years surrounded by people who wanted something from her deals, power, money, influence. She had built Carter Enterprises with relentless ambition, fighting her way to the top of an industry dominated by men who underestimated her. And yet, the one man she wanted to fight for her hadn't even tried. Jake had just stood there, silent, watching her go, like he had known all along that she would, like he had never expected her to stay in the first place. The thought made her chest tighten, because deep down she realized he hadn't been wrong. She belonged to a world very different from his. She was Isabella Carter, CEO of Carter Enterprises, a woman who made billion-dollar decisions before breakfast, who had spent her entire life building an empire that never allowed for hesitation. And Jake? Jake was a man who fixed things, except for the one thing that had mattered most to him, himself. The rain had cleared hours ago, leaving behind a darkened sky streaked with silver clouds. The highway was mostly empty, save for the occasional pair of headlights passing by. But even though Isabella was headed back to her world, something about this drive felt different. She had driven this road before, countless times, but this time she wasn't escaping to the city. She was leaving something behind. Her phone sat on the passenger seat, buzzing with messages, but she ignored them. She wasn't ready to be Isabella Carter, CEO again. Not yet. Because for the first time in a long time, she had started to feel like just Isabella, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to let go of that. By the time she reached Manhattan, the skyline towered above her, its glass and steel reflecting the last golden light of the setting sun. This was her kingdom. And yet, as she drove through the familiar streets, past Carter Enterprises headquarters, past the elite restaurants and exclusive hotels where she had brokered some of the most powerful deals of her career, it all felt different. It was still her world, but it no longer felt like the only world that mattered. She pulled into the underground parking lot of her building, the familiar cold of the city wrapping around her like an old suit she had outgrown. Her phone buzzed. Eleanor. She let it ring twice before answering. Isabella? Eleanor's voice was sharp, professional, but laced with an urgency that caught her attention. Where the hell have you been? The board is on the verge of a meltdown. Isabella sighed, pressing her fingers to her temple. I'm back. Good, Eleanor exhaled, because you need to see this. 20 minutes later, Isabella sat in her penthouse, staring at her laptop screen, scrolling through the latest corporate reports. Her absence had caused ripples. Investors had started asking questions. The media had begun speculating. But that wasn't what made her stomach drop. It was the press release from Carter Enterprises, the official announcement of the acquisition of D&L Automotive. She clicked on the news article. A digital rendering of a corporate billboard flashed onto the screen, one that had already been installed in Fairfield. Carter Enterprises, expanding into Fairfield. A stronger future. Her breath caught. A stronger future? She could already picture what that future looked like. A boarded-up factory, workers left without jobs, families forced to leave the only home they had ever known. Jake, his town, his people, and she was the one responsible for it. The weight of it crashed over her like a tidal wave. She had spent her entire life making decisions based on profits, market value, and economic projections. But now, she saw faces behind the numbers, and she couldn't ignore them anymore. Isabella stood, abruptly, knocking over her glass of wine. She didn't even notice. She had to fix this, because for the first time in her life, she wasn't just thinking about the bottom line. She was thinking about what was right. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling window of her penthouse, staring out at the glittering city below, a world of power, a world of wealth, but also a world that had no place for people. Like Jake, she had spent her entire career believing that strength meant winning at all costs. But now, Now she wasn't so sure, because Jake was strong too, just in a different way, and if she let this deal go through, if she let Fairfield be destroyed, she would be proving that her world would always swallow people like him whole. She couldn't. Let that happen, she wouldn't, and maybe, just maybe, she couldn't lose him either. The boardroom of Carter Enterprises was a battlefield, a sleek, glass-walled fortress high above Manhattan, where power was measured in stock prices and bottom lines, where deals were won or lost in the span of a conversation. And today, Isabella. Carter was about to do something unthinkable. She had spent her entire career dominating this room, but for the first time, she wasn't here to secure a deal, she was here to destroy one. The meeting had barely begun before Victor Lancaster, the CFO, leaned forward, his sharp gaze fixed on her. "Isabella, we need to finalize the D&L acquisition today. Investors are expecting movement." The other board members nodded in agreement. Their eyes held no emotion, just profit margins and expectations. She set down her pen, fingers curling against the smooth wood of the table. "There's been a change of plans," she said evenly. The room stilled. Victor narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" "I'm cancelling the acquisition," Isabella said. A murmur swept through the boardroom, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and immediate resistance. Miriam Graves, the chief legal officer, let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Is this a joke?" Isabella's expression didn't waver. "No," she said, "we're pulling out of the deal." The room erupted. Victor's face darkened. "Isabella, this acquisition has been in motion for months. Backing out now is not just a poor business decision, it's reckless." "I disagree," she countered. D&L Automotive is the backbone of Fairfield. If we move forward with this deal, we'll be destroying an entire town. "Since when do we concern ourselves with saving towns?" Victor snapped. "This is business. We eliminate competition. We dominate markets. We maximize profit. That's what Carter Enterprises does. And maybe it's time we rethink that," Isabella said, her voice firm, unwavering. "This is absurd," one of the senior board members muttered. "Do you know how much this company stands to gain from the acquisition?" "Of course I do," Isabella said calmly. "But do you know how much Fairfield stands to lose?" Silence. Victor's eyes narrowed. "Isabella, this isn't personal. It's strategy. You're one of the best in the business because you understand that sentimentality doesn't belong in this room." Isabella met his gaze without flinching. "And maybe that's the problem." Miriam leaned forward, her expression cold and measured. "Isabella, you're making a decision that could jeopardize everything. If investors pull out, let them," Isabella interrupted, a sharp intake of breath from someone at the table. Victor's eyes gleamed with challenge. "You're willing to risk your own position for this?" The unspoken threat hung in the air. She understood what he was really saying. Walk away from this deal, and you might not be CEO much longer. And yet, for the first time in her career, she didn't care. She thought about Jake, his town, the people who depended on that factory. She thought about what kind of person she wanted to be. Isabella straightened in her seat. "Yes, I am." More silence. Finally, Victor leaned back, studying her with something that almost resembled admiration, but was mostly frustration. "You just made a very dangerous move," he murmured. She lifted her chin. "I know," and she didn't regret it. The meeting ended with no clear resolution. The board needed time to assess the situation, which meant they were scrambling to figure out how to push her out of her own company without tanking the stock price. Isabella walked out of the room without looking back. She had other things to do. That night, she sat in her penthouse, laptop open, putting her plan into motion. If Carter Enterprises wouldn't save Fairfield, she would. She established a private fund under an anonymous foundation, one designed to support small-town auto businesses. But it wasn't just about Fairfield. It was about something bigger. a network of independent mechanics like Jake who had built something worth protecting. Then she made her first investment. Jake's garage. She wired the money quietly, ensuring it wouldn't look like a personal gift. No, this was a business decision, disguised as a grant, meant to support an independent mechanic who didn't even know he needed saving. And he wouldn't know. Not yet. Because if there was one thing she understood about Jake Mitchell, it was this: he wouldn't accept help if he knew it came from her. She closed her laptop, staring at the city lights outside her window. She had just risked everything, her career, her company, her entire reputation, on one choice. But she didn't regret it, because for the first time she had done something not for profit, not for power, but simply because it was right. Still, she knew the moment Jake found out, he wouldn't see it that way, and she wasn't ready to face what that meant yet. The first thing Isabella noticed as she drove back into Fairfield was that something was wrong. The town, which had once felt warm and welcoming, now carried a weight in the air, an unspoken hostility that she couldn't ignore. People who had once smiled at her turned away, their expressions tight, their movements rushed. Conversations hushed when she passed. She slowed the car, glancing around. The small-town charm was still there, but the people had changed, or rather, their feelings toward her had. A sinking feeling settled in her stomach. Something had happened. Something bad. She parked outside Mitchell's garage, stepping out slowly, her heels crunching against the gravel. Jake was nowhere in sight. Instead, a group of locals stood near the gas station across the street, watching her with guarded eyes. She recognized some of them: the owner of the diner, an elderly man who had always greeted her kindly, the teenage boy who had once offered to carry her coffee from the shop. Now, they looked at her like a stranger. An older woman, someone she had seen behind the counter at the bakery, whispered something to the man next to her. He shook his head, his expression grim. A teenage boy, no older than 16, scowled in her direction before kicking a loose stone on the pavement. Her heart pounded. She didn't belong here anymore. Swallowing hard, she took a step forward. "Excuse me, do you know where Jake is?" The man who had been shaking his head let out a dry laugh. "Like you don't know." Isabella's brow furrowed. After everything you've done, you still have the nerve to come back here." Her pulse skipped. "Look, I don't know what you're talking about, but I need to find Jake," the woman scoffed. "Oh, honey, I think he's done being found by you." A sharp chill ran down Isabella's spine. She needed answers. Now. Her gaze flickered downward to a newspaper discarded on a wooden bench outside the store. The bold black headline made her stomach drop. Carter Enterprises acquires Fairfield. Auto factory closure imminent. The hands shook as she snatched up the paper, scanning the article. It wasn't true. She had shut down the deal. She had fought against it, but the article made it seem like she had led the charge, like she had come here to buy Jake's town, rip it apart, and leave. A cold sweat ran down her spine. She needed to find Jake. Now. The garage doors were open. She stepped inside, her voice shaking slightly. "Jake?" Silence. Then, from the far corner, he emerged, wiping grease from his hands with slow, deliberate movements. The moment their eyes met, she knew. He had seen the article. His jaw was clenched, his blue eyes cold, completely unreadable. For the first time, she saw something in his gaze that she had never seen before. Disappointment, not just anger, not just resentment, but the kind of disappointment that only comes from someone who had dared to hope. "Jake, it's not true," she said quickly. "I need to explain. You need to leave." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her breath caught. "I didn't—" "You used me," Jake said, his voice like steel. "I should have known." Her heart twisted. "That's not what happened." "Isn't it?" he snapped, stepping forward. You show up in the middle of a storm, play the part of the lost city girl, get close to me, to this town, and the whole time you were planning to gut it from the inside out. Jake, you don't get to say my name like that, he cut her off. His tone razor-sharp, her throat burned. How could he believe this? She had fought, risked everything for him, for this town. And now, the one person she had done it all for wouldn't even hear her out. I called off the deal, she said, forcing herself to stay calm. I fought the board. I stopped it from happening. Jake let out a harsh laugh. Yeah, tell that to the news. She shook her head fiercely. Someone leaked false information. It's not real, Jake. You have to believe me. But his walls were already up, stronger than ever. Believe you? His voice was quiet now, dangerous. I don't know how I was stupid enough to trust you in the first place. Her vision blurred. She had never wanted to hurt him. But it didn't matter, did it? Because in his eyes, she already had. The silence between them stretched too long, too painful. Jake exhaled heavily, running a hand through his hair, then pointed toward the garage door. Go back to your world, Isabella. A sharp pain twisted in her chest. This isn't about our worlds being different, she whispered. This is about whether or not you trust me. Jake's expression didn't change, and that was how she knew. She had already lost him. The betrayal he felt, whether it was real or not, was stronger than anything between them. So she did the only thing left to do. She turned and walked away, and this time he didn't stop her. The city skyline stretched before Isabella, glittering and vast, but for the first time in her life, it felt empty. She had built this empire. Carter Enterprises was her legacy, her life's work. And yet, as she sat in her office, staring at the pile of documents on her desk, all she could think about was a small town miles away and a man who no longer trusted her. Jake's words haunted her. You used me. I should have known. No. She had fought for Fairfield. She had fought for him, and if he refused to believe her, then she would find proof, because Isabella Carter had never walked away from a fight. Her first step was finding out who had leaked the false report. She had already suspected Victor Lancaster. He had been furious about her decision to kill the acquisition. But suspecting wasn't enough. She needed evidence, and Isabella never made a move without proof. She pulled up her company's internal communications logs, scanning the emails and press releases that had been issued in the past 2 weeks. She wasn't surprised when she saw it, a leaked memo about the D&L acquisition, dated the morning after she had rejected the deal. But the most damning part, it was signed with her name. Her blood ran cold. Victor hadn't just leaked information, he had forged her approval to make it look like she had gone back on her word. The betrayal stung, but it also ignited something inside her, a fury that burned hotter than any corporate battle she had ever fought. He had underestimated her, and that was his mistake. She stormed into Victor's office without knocking. He looked up from his desk, feigning surprise. Isabella, what a... Cut the act, she snapped, throwing the leaked document onto his desk. I know what you did. Victor smirked, leaning back in his chair. I have no idea what you're talking about. Don't play games with me, Victor. She leaned in, her voice deadly calm. You forged my approval, leaked it to the press, and made me look like a liar. He didn't even flinch. And, Isabella's fingernails dug into her palm, you sabotaged me. I protected this company, he corrected. You were making a mistake, throwing away a multi-million-dollar acquisition for a backwater town and some mechanic you barely know. Her jaw tightened. This was never about the company. It was about control. Victor sighed, standing up. You don't get it, do you, Isabella? You built this empire by being ruthless. That's why the board backed you. That's why investors trusted you. But the moment you started caring, you became a liability. She met his gaze, her voice quiet but sharp. Then maybe I don't want to be that kind of leader anymore. Victor's smirk faltered. "You're making a mistake." "No," she said firmly. "You did." She turned on her heel, already dialing her attorney. Victor. Lancaster had just lost his job. Meanwhile, back in Fairfield, Jake sat alone in his garage. The article still sat on the workbench, its words burned into his mind. Carter Enterprises acquires Fairfield Auto. The headline felt like a betrayal, and yet something about it didn't sit right. Jake had learned to trust his instincts, and something told him that Isabella wasn't lying. But he had spent so many years learning not to trust people like her, the ones who came from power, who made decisions without thinking about the lives they affected. He had let his guard down for the first time in years, and he had gotten hurt again, or had he? He let out a heavy sigh, rubbing a hand over his face. A part of him wanted to believe her, and that terrified him more than anything. 3 days later, Isabella was back in Fairfield. This time she didn't hesitate. She marched straight into the garage, determination in her every step. Jake looked up from under the hood of a car, surprise flickering in his eyes before his expression hardened. "You shouldn't be here." Isabella didn't flinch. "You're going to listen to me." Jake wiped his hands on a rag, his jaw set in a firm line. "I think we're past that." She pulled a folder from her bag and dropped it onto the workbench. "Read it," she said. He didn't move. "Jake," her voice softened, "please." Reluctantly, he picked up the papers, and as he read, his entire posture shifted. The truth was there in black and white. Victor Lancaster had forged the memo, orchestrated the false article, and tried to frame Isabella for it. Jake swallowed hard. Paper shook slightly in his hands. Isabella watched him carefully. "I fought for this town, Jake. I fought for you, and you didn't even give me a chance to prove it." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Jake looked up, and in his eyes she saw it, the realization, the regret, and something else. Something she hadn't dared to hope for, not forgiveness, not yet, but the possibility of it. Jake exhaled slowly. "I don't know how to fix this." Isabella took a step closer. "Then let's figure it out together." And this time, he didn't push her away. The early morning light spilled over Fairfield, painting the town in soft gold and amber. The storm that had once threatened to destroy everything between them had passed. Now, all that remained was what came next. Jake Mitchell had never been a man of many words. He had spent his life fixing things, engines, transmissions, broken taillights, but he had never learned how to fix a mistake like this. And this time, he was the one who had broken something. Isabella stood in front of him, her eyes steady but guarded, waiting. He had spent so much time thinking she would leave, that she belonged to a world that had no place for someone like him. But the truth? She had never walked away. Not from him, not from this town, and now he wasn't going to let her go without a fight. Jake exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I screwed up." A small, sad smile touched Isabella's lips. "Yeah, you did." His chest tightened. "I should have believed you." She tilted her head, studying him. "Why didn't you?" He let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. "Because I've spent my whole life learning that people like you don't fight for people like me." Isabella swallowed. "That's not fair," she said softly. "I fought, Jake. I fought harder than I ever have." "I know." His voice was rough, thick with regret. "I know, and I still pushed you away." She didn't say anything, because they both knew the truth. He had let his past dictate his future. He had let fear of losing something real, drive him to destroy it first. Jake took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "You once asked me to trust you," he murmured. "I didn't, but I'm asking you now. Can you trust me to make this right?" For the first time, she hesitated, not because she didn't want to, but because she needed to be sure. "That depends," she said, her voice quieter now. "Are you going to run again?" His jaw clenched. "No," he said, "not this time." For years, Isabella had believed that Carter Enterprises defined her, that success was measured in boardroom victories, stock prices, and the empire she had built with her own 2 hands. But Fairfield had changed her. Jake had changed her. And for the first time in her life, she was starting to realize that power didn't come from sitting at the head of a conference table. It came from the choices she made. Which was why, 3 days after she and Jake had finally spoken the truth, she stood in the very same boardroom she had once ruled over and made a choice that would change everything. "I'm stepping down," she announced. The room erupted. "Isabella, this is insane." Victor, now demoted and powerless, hissed, "You built this company." "Exactly," she said. "And that's why I know it'll survive without me." Eleanor, standing at her side, smiled just slightly. "You don't have to do this," she murmured. Isabella glanced toward the skyline outside, the city that had once felt like home. It wasn't anymore. She turned back to Eleanor. "Yeah," she said, "I do." And just like that, she walked away. It had been 6 months since she left the corporate world behind, and Fairfield, it had never felt more like home. Jake's garage was now bigger than ever, thanks to the independent mechanic fund Isabella had created. She still wore designer heels, still carried herself with the kind of confidence that never wavered. But instead of spending her days in boardrooms, she spent them working on projects that mattered. Fairfield's Community Center, a new initiative to help small-town businesses. A life that made a difference. And Jake was still Jake, still stubborn, still a little rough around the edges, still the man who had once fixed her car without expecting anything in return. Only now, he was hers, and she was his. One evening, as they sat on the hood of his truck, watching the sun dip behind the hills, Isabella turned to him. "You ever think about what would have happened if you never stopped that night?" she asked. Jake smirked. "I wouldn't be sitting here, that's for sure." She nudged him. "No, really. What if we had never met?" Jake was quiet for a moment. Then, with a slow, knowing smile, he said, "Then I guess the universe would have found another way to bring us together." Her heart swelled, and when he leaned in to kiss her, slow and deep, she knew some things were just meant to be. Hey there, romance lovers. Before we dive deeper into this unforgettable love story, I want to ask you, where are you watching from today? Are you cozied up at home with a warm cup of coffee? Or maybe you're on a road trip, just like Isabella was on that stormy night. Let me know in the comments below. I love hearing where our amazing community is tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a single chapter of love, heartbreak, and redemption. Turn on those notifications, give this video a thumbs up, and let's keep this journey going together. Thank you so much for watching and for being part of this incredible community. Your support means the world, and I can't wait to share more unforgettable love stories with you. See you in the next one.